Widzimy teraz, jak w sumie niewielką częścią przedsięwzięć realizowanych w Lubawie przez Fundację Nicolaus Copernicus jesteśmy my, uczeni zajmujący się historią astronomii i Mikołajem Kopernikiem. Tym bardziej czujemy się wyróżnieni, że możemy przed Państwem przedstawiać rezultaty naszych poszukiwań i przemyśleń. Zaczniemy od wykładów dwóch naszych dostojnych gości, którzy znaleźli czas i siły, by ponad Atlantykiem przylecieć do Polski i znaleźć się w Lubawie. Profesor André Goddu jest znanym badaczem Mikołaja Kopernika w skali światowej. Jest autorem bardzo ważnej książki prezentującej zaplecze naukowe Mikołaja Kopernika, jakie mógł pozyskać, będąc studentem najpierw Akademii Krakowskiej. I w związku z tym jest doskonale predestynowany do tego, by opowiedzieć nam również o tym, jak Mikołaj Kopernik funkcjonował, oddziałując z różnymi intelektualnymi przyjaciółmi poznawanymi i zarówno w czasie studiów, jak i później będąc tutaj w armii, ponieważ kanonicy warmińscy należeli do najlepiej wykształconych osób. W związku z tym w wersji troszeczkę sparafrazowanej pozwoliłem sobie przełożyć tytuł angielski wystąpienia profesora Goddu jako Samotny w sieci, Kopernik i inni. Ci inni w domyśle są wszyscy ci, którzy mieli istotny wpływ na przede wszystkim naukową działalność Mikołaja Kopernika. Jest to projekt, który profesor Goddu w tej chwili realizuje. Nie jest to, jak rozumiem, finał, tylko przedstawienie pewnych otwierających sprawę idei, także tym ciekawsze, jak sądzę, będzie to wystąpienie. Serdecznie zapraszam.
Good morning, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. Polish hospitality is indeed overwhelming, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to share with you ideas that I'm developing on a project, as Dr. Włodarczyk had mentioned, and also perhaps to explain why an American has spent the last 30 years of his life devoted largely to trying to understand Copernicus's achievement. And so with that, and for the sake of the interpreters, I will now abide by my text. So the solitary networker, the circles around Copernicus. Just as Ludwig Antoni Birkemeyer inspired, stimulated, and encouraged me to take Nicholas Copernicus at his word about the problems and situations that gave him the occasion to consider the motion of Earth, so too did Birkemeyer suggest to me the idea of Copernicus as a networker. During his days as a student in Krakow, Copernicus made friends and acquaintances and remained in contact with some of them for over 40 years. His correspondence reveals contact with scholars in Nuremberg and his studies in Italy that put him in direct contact with the circle of Regiomontanus. In addition, while in Padua, Copernicus visited booksellers there and in Venice, where he purchased many of the books that would assist him in his astronomical work and practice as a medical advisor to his colleagues and friends in Warmia, as well as to other figures in the Kingdom of Poland and in Königsberg. As an assistant to his uncle, Bishop Lucas Watzenrode, Copernicus became deeply involved in the business of the bishopric and territory of Warmia, which also entailed negotiations with representatives of the Polish monarchy and the Teutonic Knights. He cultivated contacts with physicians and officials in Gdańsk, and of course it was in Warmia that he developed the two most important professional relationships of his life. His fellow canon and later bishop, Tiedemann Giese, and the Lutheran assistant, Georg Joachim Redikus, were, as we know, indispensable for their encouragement and assistance in the completion of his major work. My aim here is to describe briefly the project that I have in mind, by means of which I hope to portray Copernicus's solitary achievement as dependent on not just his predecessors, but also on the circles that he cultivated during the course of his lifetime. Now, by comparison with that indefatigable networker, Erasmus of Rotterdam, Copernicus's networking was anemic. But then, nearly everyone's networking in the 16th century seems anemic by comparison with that of Erasmus, who seems to have been in correspondence with nearly every important humanistic and religious figure of the era. While Copernicus was comparatively unknown to contemporaries, it would not take long for him to be included among the most important figures of the 16th century, especially the rebellious polemicist Luther and the intellectual moralist Erasmus. Partly because of Copernicus's focus on technical astronomy, the explicit challenge to common sense, and his more limited circle, his renown was diffused more gradually. Copernicus once described himself as working alone in a remote corner of the world, and he also admitted his fear of reactions to his novel and unconventional opinions, which nearly induced him to abandon his work completely. Aside from his anticipation of rejection and even calumny, he seemed also to be suggesting that his efforts to reform ancient astronomy would be dismissed as the result of his removal from standard scholarly circles. Later, Giese confirmed that Copernicus loved privacy. It is true, of course, that Copernicus produced his first sketch in Lidzbark-Varminski without assistance from others, as far as we know, and later his revised, mature theory pretty much on his own, surrounded by his sources, until Georg Joachim Redikus intervened in 1539, just 4 years before the publication of De Revolutionibus. The image of Copernicus, the isolated scholar, is belied, however, by the inclusion of the names of two of his supporters and by a letter from one of them in the prefatory material of his major work, where we get a sense that Copernicus had some influential contacts and that rumors about his theory had been circulating for quite some time. In fact, Copernicus relied extensively on contacts from his days as a student at the university in Krakow, and on several scholars in Italy, some of whom belonged to the circle of Feuerbach and Regiomontanus. He was in correspondence with scholars in Nuremberg, and it was Redikus who later arranged the connections with Petraeus that led to the publication of his major work. It is true that we have little documentary evidence of exactly what Copernicus took away from these associations, but we have sufficient evidence to justify a project that attempts to flesh out Copernicus's reliance on others. Here I will sketch what we know, and I will suggest what more we may be able to infer from his writings. We have the advantage of the contributions of many scholars, not least of whom is Ludwig Antony Birkenmeier. Because Copernicus entered Krakow University in 1491, a little older than students ordinarily do, we may assume that he had already received instruction in the basics of Latin grammar, rhetoric, and logic. But his later works also suggest that he absorbed techniques of dialectical argumentation that were taught and practiced at Krakow, and that he may have reinforced later through his legal studies at Bologna. We do not know which classes he attended or who his teachers were, but we can make some reasonable guesses based on the curriculum at Krakow, his attendance between 1491 and 1495, and the works that he produced. It seems very likely that he was trained in techniques that touched on the relation between the antecedents and consequences, if-then inferences, and between hypotheses and conclusions, hypothetical deductive arguments, and on the evaluation of arguments, and that he later took advantage of these techniques to develop his critique of Ptolemaic astronomy. The medieval university curriculum trained and drilled students in logic, requiring students to devote 1/5 of their time in lectures and exercises to logical texts. Copernicus was almost certainly instructed in such techniques by students of John of Ligovia, and echoes of John's teaching on dialectic can be found in Copernicus's critique of the so-called equant model, where he objected to the omission of something essential and the admission of extraneous and irrelevant elements in Ptolemy's solution to the problem of observed non-uniform motions. Copernicus's training in natural philosophy would have introduced him to standard Aristotelian doctrine, but also to medieval developments dependent on commentaries with a Neoplatonic bent, and also to Platonic developments of the early Renaissance. In astronomy, it is extremely unlikely that he attended classes taught by Albert of Brujevo, and possibly did not know Albert's Commentariolum directly, but it is virtually certain that he attended lectures on Albert's commentary, on and critique of Feuerbach's work on the Theorica of the Planets. In short, thanks to recent advances in dialectical argumentation and in astronomy at Krakow, Copernicus was positioned to undertake his own analysis and evaluation of the state of astronomy, and to follow it with a critique that would lead to his first heliocentric theory some 15 years after he left the university. While at the university, he acquired the following acquaintances and friends: Lawrence Corvinus, Bernard Volkovsky, Nicholas Shadek, and Martin Biem of Vaucouche. In the case of some of these friends, we know from now lost letters mentioned by Brožek that they conferred with one another on observations of eclipses. It was also, of course, to Volkovsky that Copernicus sent his short treatise on the motion of the eighth sphere. There is also mention of Martin Biem of Vaucouche, who recorded observations in his copy of the Stoeffler Almanac from 1499, which also contained information on the geographical latitudes of several European cities. And under an entry for 12 May 1504, he recorded an observation of a conjunction of Saturn with Jupiter according to Copernicus. Further connections with Volkovsky are all related to the University of Krakow and to Volkovsky's interests in astrology. In 1504 in particular, the conjunction of Saturn with Jupiter aroused a great deal of interest, and there seems to have been communication between Volkovsky, Biem, and Copernicus on the event. For Volkovsky and Biem, the event was especially important for astrological reasons, but Copernicus seems rather to have focused on establishing precisely the date of the conjunction. These circumstances are also important because it had formerly been widely believed that Copernicus was still in Italy in 1504. But these and other records have confirmed that Copernicus returned permanently to Varmia in 1503 or the beginning of 1504. It is virtually certain that Copernicus would have traveled through Krakow and probably would have waited for a few days with his friends. In later years, Bion worked on observations connected with his work on the reform of the Julian calendar, and as we know, Copernicus suggested later that his theory might somehow contribute to that correction. In 1535, a letter by Wapowski to Sigismund von Herberstein documents that Copernicus had composed an almanac that corrected the motions of the planets from new tables, which Wapowski suggested were based on his new theory, resulting in changes in the aspects of the planets to each other. The calculation of the aspects was incomplete, but Wapowski indicated that they could be supplied by any competent astrologer and further emphasized their importance for meteorology and horoscopes. The emphasis on aspects is significant, for it confirms Copernicus's awareness of the relevance of his theory for astrology. There is some circumstantial reason for thinking that Copernicus's interest in astrology may have been restricted to issues of natural philosophy, that is, questions related to physical or qualitative causes and effects, and to more closely related to meteorology and perhaps medicine, although there is little or no evidence that astrological considerations affected his medical practice. As late as 1530, there is indirect evidence of a continued connection between Nicholas Schadeck and Copernicus. Finally, a lunar eclipse recorded by Copernicus for 29 January 1534 shows that he observed it in Krakow, further confirming speculation about occasional visits, continued contacts with old colleagues, and persistent observational activity. In comparison with his association with Dominicus Maria Novara, these earlier contacts have been relatively obscured in the literature. Through Novara, on the other hand, we know that Copernicus cultivated a connection with the works of Regiomontanus and Cardinal Bessarion. His reliance on Regiomontanus for his knowledge and critique of Ptolemy is well known, but his familiarity with Bessarion's treatise defending Plato has been cited rarely. There are all sorts of suggestions in Bessarion's text that may have impressed Copernicus and led him to Ficino's translation of Plato's works. And from it, he may have seen a model of reasoning that served him in his formulation of the postulates and commentarios. Some works of Regiomontanus and Ficino were available in Krakow from the late 1480s and early 1490s. So we cannot, of course, prove that Novara was the exclusive conduit by means of which Copernicus encountered the works of Regiomontanus, Bessarion, and Ficino, but it is conceivable that without Novara as a link, Copernicus's acquaintance with the work of his 15th century predecessors might have been impoverished and perhaps even obstructed or at least delayed. Copernicus's contact with Cardinal Nicholas Schoenberg possibly dates back to 1518, but certainly to the 1530s. In the famous letter of 1536, just a year before his death, the cardinal testifies that he had heard some years earlier about Copernicus's proficiency in mathematics and about his new theory. Copernicus preserved this letter, so there can be little doubt that it encouraged him to complete his work. Just 3 years earlier, in 1533, Johann Albrecht Wittgenstein explained the Copernican theory to Pope Clement VII in the presence of several church dignitaries. The significance of this detail, aside from confirming interest as early as 1533 in Copernicus's theory, is that Wittgenstein and Schoenberg were in close contact, and that by 1535, Wittgenstein had become a secretary and member of Schoenberg's household. Indeed, it is possible that Schoenberg's letter to Copernicus was written in Wittgenstein's hand. Where did Wittgenstein learn of the Copernican theory? Certainly not from Commentariolus, but possibly from Theodoric of Radzin, then representative of the Varmia chapter in Rome, or from Dantiscus, who was in Rome in 1533 and was almost certainly acquainted with some of the details of Copernicus's work. In any case, these contacts suggest again the extent to which the circles around Copernicus contributed to his decision to allow his friends to publish his work. Finally, we come to Tiedemann Giese and Rheticus, about whom little has to be said as far as their indispensable role in the completion and publication of revolutions is concerned. There is no reason whatsoever to doubt that Giese supported Copernicus's theory, and it is clear that without Rheticus's intervention, Copernicus might never have completed it or had it published by Petraeus in Nuremberg. Of course, that connection led to Osiander's intervention, which, ironically, however, may have saved Copernicus's book from condemnation for 73 years. We must also enter a cautionary note about Rheticus. Copernicus may have concealed much, even from Rheticus, apparently, who seems to have been unaware of the Commentariolus and of the letter to Werner. Since Rheticus's reported biography of Copernicus has disappeared, we cannot be certain. But perhaps we need to be more circumspect in connecting Rheticus too closely to Copernicus. On the other hand, it is also possible that Copernicus did inform him, and that Rheticus decided to suppress any comment about him for fear of undermining the reception of the mature theory. Rheticus was probably Copernicus's source for the observations of Mercury by Bernhard Walther, two of which Copernicus misattributed to Johannes Schörner, Rheticus's own source. The point of my project is to document precisely and explicitly that Copernicus relied on teachers, colleagues, friends, acquaintances, and contacts to begin his critique of Ptolemaic astronomy, to collect observational data, to communicate his earliest thoughts, perhaps in the form of trial balloons, and to construct a heliocentric version adequate to Ptolemy's and as an alternative to it that would resolve the problems of ancient astronomy and complete its reformation. In other words, the solitary work of criticism, analysis, imagination, seeking solutions that eventually led to a breakthrough, took place in a mind that had been prepared, supported, and sustained by others. Without more documentation, we can never know fully the details of that process, but we can perhaps divine key moments of realization, recognition, and resolution. My project will, I hope, contribute to the elucidation of how the circles around Copernicus pressed together around him, helping him to recognize the irrelevant and to focus his attention on the essential. In several publications now, I have drawn from Ludwig Bickermeyer the inspiration and ambition to offer an alternative reconstruction of Copernicus's path to heliocentrism. As I indicated, it was also from Birkenmeier that I conceived the idea of Copernicus's networks. In an act of near desperation, I've also undertaken a translation of Birkenmeyer's Mikołaj Kopernik from 1900 into English. An effort that humbles me and that may eventually lead to my humiliation. I myself wish that a native Polish speaker had undertaken this task, but I came to the conclusion that no scholar in Poland today was willing to do so. After more than 100 years, it seemed clear that even Polish scholars regard most of Birkenmeyer's work as outdated. Some of my Polish friends have expressed frustration, occasional disbelief, and even aggravation over Birkenmeyer's antiquated writing style. They were too polite to try to dissuade me, but I had the unmistakable feeling that they were bewildered by my decision. Let me quickly add here that there is one major exception. Jaroslav Włodarczyk was encouraged me to complete it. There may be another reason for questioning the value of a complete translation. The partial, selective, and rough translation of the work, supervised by Jerzy Dobrzycki and Owen Gingerich, to which I refer as the Smithsonian translation, presented the most important texts and materials, which perhaps also made it appear unnecessary to translate the entire work. Now, Birkenmeyer's original was and is clearly known by Polish experts, and there have been citations and uses of it in cases outside of Poland, relying on the selections by Dobrzycki and Gingerich. But I have to conclude from what I have seen that the Smithsonian translation has not had much impact on scholarship on the whole. So why have I exposed myself to predictable criticism and perhaps even ridicule? The reasons are not difficult to explain. Relying initially on the Smithsonian translation, I encountered questions, criticisms, details, insights, arguments, clarifications, and analyses of tables and mathematics, some of which can be found elsewhere, but not quite in the penetrating way that Birkenmeyer presented them. It was especially his chapter on the Uppsala Notebook that motivated me to try to produce a fresh translation of the text. And then, the more I studied it carefully, the more I began to find additional hidden gems. I would like to think that most of my translation is at least clear. But I readily acknowledge that there remain a number of complex, cryptic sentences that I have not cracked successfully. Occasionally, I did ask for assistance, but I was met with frustration, as even I could tell that the English version that I received was selective, sometimes omitting the very puzzle that I was trying to unravel. It was not that they failed to comprehend Birkenmeyer's words, they rather had difficulty finding an appropriate way to translate them into English, and so evidently concluded that it was not worth the trouble of trying to translate them. It is then with humility and with a plea for charity that I submit my efforts to the scrutiny of Polish experts. With that said, it is, however, Birkenmeyer himself, his views and insights that deserve the attention. What animated Birkenmeyer to try to illuminate Copernicus's path to his discovery? Some of his motives were, to be sure, narrowly nationalistic and hagiographical. His period, and it remained so until recently, was one of hero worship, of a celebration of progress, and of an admiration for at least some features of what we call the Enlightenment project. Birkenmeyer clearly appreciated the diligence of his predecessors, but he was frustrated by their failure to explain what needed explaining most: how Copernicus arrived at the heliocentric system. Birkenmeyer was equally aggravated by the amount of ink spilled over Copernicus's nationality and by other matters that, in his view, distracted scholars from the important questions. Not that Copernicus's nationality was a matter of indifference to him, but to focus on his nationality distorts the story of the relations Sarmatian, Polish, German, Italian, that he maintained or cultivated and that contributed to his achievement. I have framed that story in terms of his networks in this paper, and as I said, a suggestion that I also owe to Birkenmeier. There is no doubt that Birkenmeier was a pioneer in the reconstruction of Copernicus's path to heliocentrism, and one who surpassed the efforts of Maximilian Kurze in particular. The Polish mathematician and humanistically educated Birkenmeier devoted a great deal of effort to studying Copernicus's mathematics, tables, and sources. As we see from his own preface, he thought that it would take a great deal more time to produce a biography that would adequately explain Copernicus's discovery. Accordingly, Birkenmeier devoted his attention to collecting and organizing the materials that were a prerequisite for an account of the astronomer's life that would illuminate the path to his discovery. He hoped to achieve the desired result, but left open the possibility that it might be accomplished by someone else in the future. In 1900, however, Birkenmeier was still optimistic that he could do it. He formulated the fundamental questions, especially about Copernicus's sources, and set about to answer them. In the preface to Mikołaj Kopernik, he referred to the nearly completed part 2, a comment that requires some explanation. That part, we might say, was the beginning of the actual biography itself. It proceeded chronologically, focusing on the background matters, and reached the year 1500, about the time of Copernicus's journey to Rome. Birkenmeier did complete the manuscript, but left it unpublished at the Jagiellonian Library in Krakow, where it remains to this day, still unedited and unpublished. To my knowledge, Birkenmeier never explained his decision in writing, but we may surmise that he had encountered 2 obstacles in particular. The first was his belief that all of the editions of Revolutions to date had not adequately taken Copernicus's autographed copy, and still known then as the Prague manuscript, into account. In fact, also about the time that he published 2 major works in 1900, he was assigned the commission of beginning the preparation for a new edition of Revolutions. His decisions at the time set the agenda for subsequent editors, leading to the effort decades later in the Warsaw edition to produce a critical edition of the text, a text that, in fact, Copernicus and Rheticus had never succeeded in completing. In other words, until there was at least an edition that sorted out all questions about the authentic text, corrected all the lapses and minor errors, and as it were, finished what Copernicus and Rheticus had intended, then it was impossible to proceed with a definitive biography. The second obstacle was the realization that there was still more work to be done on the books and sources in Sweden. At that point, it seems that Birkenmeier concluded that completing the biography or publishing even part 2 would be premature. Instead, he continued to gather materials, publishing more on the collections in Sweden, writing some short works on Copernicus's life, and publishing another collection of materials in 1924 under the title Stromata Copernicana. These are further studies that could have contributed to the completion of the project, but the hoped-for edition of Revolutions was delayed even further. We should note as well that Birkenmeier was in ill health for much of his life, so it is amazing that he accomplished as much as he did, and in any case, within 5 years, he passed away. In retrospect, when we consider today the multiple editions of Copernicus's works, it is clear that Copernicus's oeuvre presented numerous difficulties and editorial possibilities. In fact, in nearly every modern edition, readers will find that editors present in one form or another both the text from 1543 edition, along with the autograph variants, relying on corrections that make the text more consistent than it was when it was published in 1543. The new French edition, 2015, is very likely the last, and it is arguably the best and most complete edition, especially if we consider the editor's reconstruction of books 5 and 6 based on the Greek edition of Ptolemy's Syntaxis from 1538, that is, a Latin version of it that they suppose Rheticus prepared for Copernicus's final text. Arguments over Copernicus's path to his theory continue, and so the process of reconstruction goes on. And in my view, Birkenmeyer's work and insights remain not only relevant to the discussions of the origin of Copernicus's heliocentrism, but illuminate them through his original insights about Copernicus's progress from the Commentariolis to revolutions. Thank you.